So addiction is both a psychological, emotional, spiritual, and social condition that if you only treat one element of that and then pretend everything's okay, you can leave both that person and the loved ones in a state where they're still dealing with all the dynamics of addiction, even if the person stopped using the drug, stopped the behavior.
Hello, this is Gretchen Baskerville, author of The Life-Saving Divorce. And today I'm interviewing licensed marriage and family therapist Bob Hamp. He's a Christian counselor in the Dallas, Texas area, whom I've interviewed several times on the dynamics of abuse. He also has special training in addictions and trauma. Today, we'll hear him explain the pros and cons of freedom ministries, those ministries in churches that suggest that God will absolutely set your destructive spouse free from his or her addictions, infidelity, porn, or abusive behavior. Welcome, Bob.
Well, thanks, Gretchen. I'm so excited to be with you again.
Now, many of our listeners are familiar with freedom ministries in their own church, but they are a little bit new to me. I really learned about them when I was doing interviews before I wrote the Life-Saving Divorce book. So give us an overview.
Yeah, that's when you said that in our pre-video conversation, I thought it's interesting because prior to the term freedom ministry, the terms were things like deliverance and, somewhere along the way. And I think I might have actually been the one to coin the term freedom ministry, because the guy that hired me to build one said, well, if you wouldn't call it deliverance, what would you call it? And I said, I think I'd call it freedom ministry.
Okay. Now I get it, because I am familiar with deliverance ministries. Okay, great. Thank you. That's right there. That's helpful.
So there were things like cleansing streams that came out of Jack Hayford's church in California. And then there are kind of some freestanding deliverance type ministries where the focus was often on, the expulsion of demons, and very much focused on kind of a charismatic expression of transformation. And so that's kind of the roots of those type ministries. I do think, and again, I hope I've been an influence in that. I think there's been a maturation in those type of ministries. Part of my focus, and again, I developed that ministry for a large mega church here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, kind of from scratch. They asked me to come in and develop kind of a hands-on ministry, and they felt like they were going to grow to a fairly large number. And so they said, kind of plan for 30,000 people. And I was like, okay, so that takes out a lot of the one-on-one kind of stuff that you see in those type ministries. And so I looked at a couple different models and asked God a lot of questions, and felt like I got a good opportunity to build something that was unique. What we built was what I would call more of a discipleship ministry. And it included some classes and some interaction and some places where people had a chance to really kind of think in brand new ways before they went to just do some kind of deliverance session or some kind of like power-based confrontation ministry. And in fact, again, part of what I really emphasized was that a deliverance ministry alone, or a ministry that focuses on the expulsion of demons, had its own shortcomings and things that I was concerned about. And I wanted us to focus more on the human soul, the human will, other elements besides simply whatever influence spiritual forces might have, and really do probably a more holistic look at what it took to move people from wherever they were stuck to a life of increased and ever increasing freedom. And so that was the emphasis of what we developed. The thing that I saw along the way, and one of the things that, I think I actually reached out to you about this conversation. So you're incredibly gracious about this. You and I were going back and forth with some other people on a post. And I think the thrust of that post was, my husband or my spouse has gone to this ministry, and they all say that he's doing great now. Should I just take him back and assume everything's fine? That was kind of the thrust of the post, if I remember it. And
yeah, that sounds right.
And I had to jump into that because, those type ministries can do a lot of help for people. When churches really take seriously the idea of restoring the human soul, setting people free, healing wounds from the past, helping people overcome destructive patterns in their life, when churches begin to do that and take that seriously, they can be very powerful at doing that. At the same time, I often say that inherently built into the system is the potential for great manipulation.
Yeah, explain that to us.
So first of all, when you get a lot of people together and you put them together in a hierarchy, there's kind of the potential for manipulation right away, right? So when you've got a hierarchy of people in leadership, whether paid leadership or non-paid leadership, and you've got people entering into that, vying for position, maybe even rightly so, maybe they've got a calling and a gift or something like that. But there is a potential for manipulation within those kind of ministries anyway, because if you think about the charismatic world, Gretchen, you're not only dealing with positions of authority, but you're also potentially handling what I call power-based ministries, or Holy Spirit power kind of things, where you're dealing with either deliverance or prophecy or physical healing, where people go, oh, you hold the key to miracles. So you don't just have a position of authority, you've got spiritual power. And, that kind of thing draws people that are manipulative in great number, because, people who are manipulative want influence. And what better influence than both positional power and, having been designated as someone who's got also a spiritual power.
And, it's interesting. Let me jump in here for just a second. We all assume that if a person has a position that's higher than others, we assume that the quality of their spiritual life is excellent too. Speak to that for just a second.
Yeah. So, I've worked both in private practice and I've worked at varying degrees inside the church world. By the time I left my position at that church, I was what would be typically called mid-level management. I was an executive pastor, which means that somewhere between, whatever a ground level pastor is and a senior team pastor, I was somewhere what would typically be called mid-level management. So what you see is people are hired in those positions for all kinds of reasons besides spiritual or emotional maturity. And sadly, I would say it's one of the positions in the professional world that really has very few qualifications that are actually required for the average job as a pastor or a staff pastor at a larger church. Some certain churches may have specific requirements, but in many cases, you can be hired with very little or no qualifications to be a pastor if someone thinks that you can manage a group of people, develop a program, implement a strategy. If someone believes that you've got the capacity to do that, or worst case scenario, you're just a good friend of mine and I'd love to have you come work with me. A lot of reasons besides that they have spiritual maturity and have demonstrated a track record of helping others grow to maturity.
And they don't need to go through a licensing board or a set of standards like a licensed therapist like you would have to go through, where someone could actually, contact a person's state and say, this person has broken and violated the written ethics of our state licensing board. So in churches, there aren't those guardrails that keep maybe a manipulative person or just an unqualified person from doing a fair amount of damage.
And the relationship between those two is that an unqualified person may not be very skilled at recognizing and responding well to a manipulative person. So the lack of qualifications that is in many cases present in church staff can open up the door then for the intentionally manipulative to come in and take advantage of the positional power of the people who've gotten that position without necessarily mental health training or even necessarily good human skills training. They got that job for any number of reasons besides that.
Well, there's so many experts on, for example, this is a little tangential, but on child sexual abuse, say that Christians and churches are so naive and so trusting and so optimistic about change that often they fail to protect their own people by inviting, for very idealistic reasons, people with very destructive tendencies into the church and allowing them positions of trust.
Yeah. Here's the other reason why I think these ministries are so potentially open to manipulation is exactly what you said. There's kind of an automatic assumption that forgiveness is the default setting, but there's also a significant motivation for leaders to want to prove that their program works.
That their program works, okay.
Because we're not just talking about a hospital program, we're talking about God. And of course, we want to prove to the world that God is effective at setting captives free. There's significant motivation for us to say, we're going to take the hard cases and prove ourselves on this hard case. And one way to prove that is to put them in positions that appear to demonstrate trust.
So dangerous.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds so idealistic. It sounds so godly. It sounds like such an incredible test of faith. But sometimes even Jesus said that testing faith and doing something dangerous. For example, when Satan told him to jump off the pinnacle of the temple as a way of showing that he was a special person to God, that's actually tempting the Lord your God and should not be done.
When you see a number of cases where Paul himself says there are some people we should just boot them out and never let them back. There's that tendency that we have. And I do think part of it's in the desire to prove that God is effective. But I also think there's some other reasons, and we'll talk about those, I'm sure, before we're done here. But, clearly Paul said in at least 2 instances, hey, these people are dangerous, send them away and never allow them back. And nobody criticized him and called him unforgiving. They followed his rules because he was being protective of both God's intent and the people who were following God's intent.
I think I know what passages of scripture those are. For those watching here, it's 1 Corinthians 5:11 and 2 Timothy 3:1-5, yeah, where we can forgive them, of course, but that doesn't mean we let them stay in our churches or influence people in our churches. We need to send them away. They're going the wrong direction and they're destructive. Yeah.
And both in terms of paid leadership and in terms of volunteer leadership, people look for environments where they can easily take advantage and easily find quote unquote forgiveness. So, when I did my class on spiritual abuse, one of the things I read was an article that said that of the top 10 professions where psychopaths are employed, being a pastor, I think, was number 6 or 7 in that list of 10.
That's dangerous.
Yeah. And that was a list put out by the FBI. That was
oh my goodness. Wow.
Was, top 10 professions where psychopaths are likely to be found.
Well, I think, we've been taught from, I don't know about you, but I've been raised in the church since I was born. And, we were always taught to have a lot of respect for, our leaders. It never crossed our minds that our leaders wouldn't be trustworthy. And so many of us have seen, in our lives, 50, 60 years, that's not always a safe assumption.
It is that assumed and presumed respect and submission that I think is also part of what tempts abusive people to seek out those positions. There is that automatic or that presumed message that people are told to submit to their leaders. And then there's also the automatic message that says, I'm just a man, you should forgive me. I'm just a human, you should forgive me. And
right. I'm only human. To err is human. To forgive is divine. All those sayings that pressure the injured party to forgive while excusing the one who hurt them. So you've mentioned that the potential for manipulation is really built into the system. What else? Or is there anything you want to go deeper on?
Yeah. So I want to back up for a second and talk about what's always kind of my framework about abuse. You and I have talked about it before, but I just think it's super important to recognize that abuse is almost always a triangle, right? You've got a victim, an abuser, and then you've got an onlooker or a whole group of onlookers. Those onlookers can be anything from friends who are just casually watching to professionals who are helpers or could or should be helpers. And so you've got the abuser, the victim, and the people who are triangulated into that relationship. And they're almost always triangulated in such a way as to support the abuser, right? And to undermine or to make the victim look like they're the person who's done wrong. And so these type of ministries, if they don't have a clear understanding of that dynamic and really how to recognize and discern that, just like any counselor or any helper, if you don't recognize those kind of things, and then you're motivated to prove that what you're doing is effective, you feel like you're on a mission for God, as the Blues Brothers would say, and you're set up then to prove God's forgiveness works and to help that wayward spouse come back to their poor husband. I did this training one time for a church in West Texas, and I started the training telling this story. And this is, by the way, an amalgam of like multiple times this has actually happened to me. Many churches have this model where at the end of the service, people go down front, they're like a prayer team, and people come down for prayer for their various needs, whether it be physical needs or relational needs or whatever. People come down for prayer, and the trained prayer leaders of the church are down front. The supposedly mature believers of the church are down front waiting to pray with these people. And a man comes up and says, "I want you to pray with me that my wife will come back. She left me 2 weeks ago, and I had no idea that anything was wrong. And all of her friends are supporting her, and none of them will listen to me. And I'm a good guy. I know I'm sure I've made some mistakes, but this came out of the blue. I had no idea that she was even upset. And she not only will she not come back, she won't even talk to me. And I just want you to pray that my wife will come back to me."
Yep, I've heard that one too.
And so I said this to this group that was just beginning the training. I said, if that presents itself to you, to your prayer team, you are probably speaking to an abuser in that moment. And you could kind of see the faces go, wait, we thought we were positioned to help this person, pray together with him to get his wayward spouse to return. Well, that person, go back to the dynamic. You've got the abuser and the victim. And the key thing that I always talk about, Gretchen, is this transfer of responsibility, right? The abuser takes no responsibility and puts all responsibility on their victim. And their ongoing message is, you're responsible for my reactions. You're responsible for protecting me if I react poorly. You as the victim carry all the responsibility. And I give all my responsibility to you and carry none of it. So that person presents to a church minister and says, you know what? I'm not responsible at all. This terrible person has left me. And in that moment, they're transferring responsibility, even when their spouse isn't present. And when that onlooker, the prayer person, the pastor, the helper, when that onlooker hears that story and doesn't know what to look for, they automatically join with that person in assigning responsibility to the wayward spouse who's left, when in reality, they're speaking to the one who has been continually initiating the dynamic of abuse instead of one who, quote unquote, has been receiving the dynamic of abuse.
Yeah. And I found that when I've been in these situations as the onlooker or the bystander, the abuser, at the time, I didn't know they were the abuser. They even asked for prayer. Please pray for me. Pray for me. Pray for my spouse to come back.
I just want to serve her in every way that I can. And they present as a innocent victim of the other person's bad choices.
Yeah.
Now let's fast forward for a minute. Now let's say that things come to light. It becomes clear that this person who's the abuser also drinks too much, has had a couple of affairs. And the church leaders start to get an idea that, oh gosh, this person, maybe they've been the person doing harm. We start to develop a little bit of empathy for the victim. But what we're going to do is we're going to send Fred the abuser to our freedom classes, because Fred is about to have an encounter with God. And in that encounter, he'll become a completely different man. And we'll be able to kind of put another notch on our belt that says, look, we have another success. We saved this marriage.
Yeah.
So Fred, the abuser, starts through the process, whatever their process is. He meets with their marriage ministry. He meets with their freedom ministry. He starts going through the training, whatever it is, he starts their process. Well, he's highly motivated. Now, again, we have to talk about the cycle of abuse and then the role of all three of these parties to make full sense of why this issue with the church can become so harmful instead of helpful. Because in the cycle of abuse, if the abuser feels like they've been caught or kind of seen by people, their next several steps are to kind of go through a bit of a period of remorse, and here's what I'm going to do about it, and everything's all better now. And almost
I've changed.
Exactly.
Look at me, I'm going to counseling. Look at me, I'm praying more. I'm reading my Bible every day. I've changed.
And
why don't you see my change?
Almost everything that they hold up as their badge to prove that, Gretchen, is behavior. Yeah. And listen to the last phrase you said, why don't you see that I've changed? Which is also a common part of the thing. And I know that you know that. That statement is the key defining factor to prove they haven't changed.
That proves they haven't changed.
Prove they haven't changed.
Explain that.
Because if the key isn't about behavior, but about the improper assignment of responsibility, they're still trying to assign responsibility to the other person to validate their change. They're saying, here's my list of behaviors. You are now responsible to give me an A on my report card so that I can pass the second grade and go on to the third grade. What a truly changed person would say is, I'm so sorry that you've been through this. I'm responsible for the pain that I've caused you, and I'm working on doing all the things that I know to do to make sure that I never hurt you again, and that I do what I can to make sure that I repay you for the pain I've caused you, period. Not, can't you see I've changed? Not, when will you validate my change? Not, everybody else sees it, why can't you? Those are all statements that put the responsibility back on the victim.
Right.
And here's where the church ministries come in. If they are looking only at behavior and they look and go, look, he has or she has changed because look at all the behaviors, and they can't hear, they'll actually join in putting all the weight and responsibility back on the victim. And they become secondary abusers. Again, if the primary dynamic of abuse is an inappropriate assignment of responsibility, when they assign responsibility to the victim to somehow now it's up to you to make everything okay, he or she's done all their behavioral change. Now you have to. Well, you don't have to do anything. As the victim of abuse, the only thing you can do is enter into your own healing journey. And that includes discovering what boundaries you need to set in order to stay safe and keep from being hurt again. But when now that abuser has taken the what should have been onlookers and turned them into allies, now the power of the church and the power of the authority of the church has become a backup to the abuser's power differential and just multiplied all of the dynamics of abuse.
They've just ganged up on the victim. The victim now feels pressured. And I see this both in churches, but I also see it in pro-family pro-marriage organizations. They'll tell a story in an online article about, this abusive, in this case, I'm thinking of one in particular. So it was the man who was abusive for 18 years. And the woman reacts in anger. She's furious. She, slams the door, and the ministry says, the man went to marriage counseling once, and now what we really need to do is work on the wife's anger, because the wife is so angry. She's so angry, and it's bitterness now, and we have got to get her to forgive. Well, going to marriage counseling one time is not going to change 18 years of abusive behavior and attitudes. And so it's almost humorous to watch these, to read these case studies from various organizations.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost humorous if it weren't so devastating. But it
Yeah.
happens again and again. And you and I, and those of us in the advocacy world, know that we see it. Those who are victims, it begins to dawn on them. They feel it before they see it. But it is that secondary abuse where if we only look at behavior, they can begin to feel, the victim can also begin to feel guilty because they ask themselves the question. And I think this is the post that we were conversing about is, well, maybe he really has changed. The supposed experts at the church have told me he's changed. His behavior is different. Why do I still feel like it's not different? But here's an important
And how can I go against them? You know, they lead the ministry. How is it possible that they've been snowed and I'm the one who's right? No, that must not be the case. You know, they're godly. I must be the person who's wrong. And I get what you're saying. I think that's very, very powerful. That's why victims get ganged up on inadvertently by well-meaning Christian leaders and ministry leaders.
Well, here's an important principle, Gretchen. Forgiveness is something to be applied to a past behavior that has stopped. An ongoing present behavior. Forgiveness isn't the response to that. The response to ongoing present behavior is boundaries and consequences. And so if the issue is behavior and abuse, then gosh, you can look and say he's not yelling anymore, he's not this anymore, he's not that anymore. But if the issue is the transfer of responsibility and that's still going on, forgiveness isn't the issue. If they're still saying, why don't you validate my change? Why won't you recognize it? Why won't you forgive? Anytime the abuser is using the phrase, why won't you? They're still putting the responsibility on the victim, which is really the root of abuse. And forgiveness it's not time for forgiveness because the real issue is still present and ongoing.
Right.
So
why won't you take me back? Why can't I move back home? When that's exactly what the victim needs to continue doing until they see a complete attitude change, and to see what you've just described, that the abuser takes their own responsibility for what they have done and takes steps to not hurt that person ever again.
So a couple of the key dangers then in this ministry that sets them up for even more unintended secondary abuse is that, first of all, the thing we've been saying, there's a focus on behavior instead of understanding some of the more sophisticated dynamics. When it comes to, as I always say, abusers, addicts, and serial adulterers, the dynamic is always the same. It's that inappropriate transfer of responsibility or the assignment of responsibility to the victim. But the other things, I think it's important to understand that most church ministries aren't really equipped to understand the nature of addiction, right? Addiction being, there's very much the same dynamic that we're talking about with abusers. Abuse is just a addiction to power, if you will. It's an addiction to having power over the other person. So I assign responsibility to them. Without it, I feel less than myself. So addiction is both a psychological, emotional, spiritual, and social condition that if you only treat one element of that and then pretend everything's okay, you can leave both that person and the loved ones in a state where they're still dealing with all the dynamics of addiction, even if the person stopped using the drug, stop the behavior if it's porn or whatever, stop the relational pattern. If they haven't dealt with all of the issues of addiction, you can still have people who, again, you've got the dynamic where like the spouse is going, why do I feel like nothing's okay? And everyone else is telling me it's okay. Well, he stopped drinking. Okay, stop drinking, but he still blames. He hasn't taken responsibility. He's demonstrated zero empathy. He's not making the changes that matter. He's only stopped drinking. So when church helpers don't understand some of the sophisticated elements of whether addiction or abuse, like we've been talking about, the dynamic of abuse is more subtle than people think. When people don't recognize that it's not simply a willful choice to behave, but it's driven by some deeper psychological conditions or emotional states, they want an instant fix, and they want to assign the idea that an instant fix has happened. And the victim is still sitting over there going, I don't feel safe. And now I don't feel safe in my church. And now I don't feel so safe in the helping ministry of my church. And it happens when there's a simplified view of addiction and abuse.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen this also described in marriage intensives, marriage retreats, where in the last 10 minutes of a marriage retreat, the abusive spouse suddenly has a dramatic and emotional conversion. And the leaders of the retreat say, well, okay, everything's going to be fine from now on out. And the victim is going, I've seen emotions like this before, maybe not saying these exact words, but, I don't think that anything has changed. But okay. And they go back and the abuse continues. So, if Jesus sets people free, let's just talk about the spiritual end of this. If Jesus sets people free, and if the gospel has the power to set people free, shouldn't we expect meaningful change?
Absolutely. And we should be wise to wait and see what's really happening. So I would dare assume that you and I and most of your listeners not only believe what you just said, but have experienced it. And so the tricky part of that is that the transformation that comes from our personal relationship with God is what I describe as both a moment and a process. Right? There's a moment of encounter where meaningful, powerful things happen. But there's also a process of maturity, growth, and the slow process of change, where it's one thing to say, I've stopped drinking. It's another thing to say, I've recognized my dependency traits, and those dependency traits not only apply to alcohol and substances, but to other people as well. And until I learn to be more self-motivated and less other-motivated, I'm not going to really be healthy. I've just stopped drinking. Absolutely. You and I can, because I've been a believer, I'm now 59. I've been a believer since I was 14. Mathematically, I guess that's 45 years. Wow. I'm older than I like to think, right? So 45 years. And there were some instantaneous changes, but there's also been a growth process. And it's that growth process that's important when we're talking about changing motives, changing, the foundation, so that when somebody is under pressure, they don't go back to their old coping mechanisms. And so absolutely, we should expect real transformation. I think we can even expect sometimes miraculous transformation. But I think we also have to leave lots of room for the maturation process. I've seen Jesus set people free from a lot of things, but I've never seen him set people free from immaturity.
I love that. So, okay, I have to ask this then. I've got a whole private Facebook group full of people who are committed people of faith. I mean, these people went the extra mile. They forgave, they didn't give just second, third, and fourth chances. They gave 100th chances. I mean, they were treated very poorly and day after day walked right back into that door. I mean, they have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that they believed in the sanctity of marriage. So when a well-meaning ministry leader says to them, your spouse has changed, look at this wonderful conversion experience. Look, he or she is telling their testimony in front of groups. People are becoming saved due to their testimony. What do you recommend that the victims either say or think to themselves when they get this kind of pressure?
Honestly, Gretchen, there's so much that needs to be said about that. I'll tell you, this is not flattery. I send so many of those people to your work because A, you're so biblically sound, and B, you systematically pick apart the foundations that ministry people use to send people back into abuse. And I think you do that as well as anybody I know. Like I said, it's not flattery. It's just because it's not a simple answer. And what I would say is that person at some point has to be able to look separate from what they're being told, separate from what their spouse is saying, separate from what they're being told anywhere else, and pay attention to what's going on here. If you still don't feel safe, give that credibility. And if you need to know why, look to some of the resources. Look at my teaching on the dynamic of abuse so that you can understand what's really happening. Look at Gretchen's teaching on, what Malachi 2 really says. Look at, there's so many important resources out there. I think you almost have to rebuild your belief system. And I would also say, and I think many people end up having to leave their churches because they get so ganged up on. The abuse has simply been multiplied, and they have been identified as the abuser, not just by their spouse, but by multiple leaders. Sometimes you have to leave.
Yeah. Yeah. And when I did interviews prior to writing the life-saving divorce book, I found people who said that exact thing. They were being pressured so much to sweep everything under the carpet, to smooth things over, when they weren't really sure that it was safe. And so they just said, for now, I'm not going to meet with you, Pastor, anymore. I'm not going to participate in this ministry. I need to step back. And it's not saying no to our faith or saying no to God. It's just saying, I'm not sure that you're directing me in the correct path, and I don't feel safe. So I'm backing away. And maybe you don't even say that. Maybe just execute it, just walk away. And there is a saying that, sometimes you have to divorce your abusive spouse and divorce your abusive ministry leader too.
Yeah. Brene Brown has her book, Braving the Wilderness. And it talks about that kind of point in your life where you come to grips with the fact that maybe the life you've created for yourself doesn't surround you with people who are actually your people. Mm-hmm. And kind of the terrifying and exhilarating moment that comes when you say, if that's the case, then I've got to go find my people. And the season in between when you leave your tribe and you find your tribe is what she describes as the wilderness. Incredibly frightening place to be. And if you'll let it be, it's an incredibly exhilarating place to be. But, I think you have to be willing to at least consider that if you're up against both an abuser and a church leadership that hasn't been willing to see and acknowledge. Can I take a second? I want to talk about a specific model.
Yeah.
That I think is particularly, I think, what I've said is that all these helping ministries in the church that are designed to do good have the potential to do harm. But I think there's one that really, in my mind, sets us up for, I think, some particularly dangerous issues, and that is this thing called biblical counseling.
Is that the same thing as nouthetic counseling? And
yeah,
what does that mean? Is that different from Christian counseling?
Absolutely. So biblical counseling actually is kind of the most consistently used term for this thing called nouthetic counseling. And it all kind of comes out of the work of a guy named Jay Adams. And his whole idea was that all of us as believers are competent to counsel. It's the title of one of his early books is Competent to Counsel. Because we've got the Spirit inside of us, because we have the wisdom of the scriptures, we should be competent to provide counsel for people. And there's a part of me that would genuinely say, if we genuinely operate out of the presence of Christ inside of us, the encounter with a loving God and the wisdom of the Spirit of God moving through us should give us those moments where we can really impact people's lives with power, not because we have a degree or a license, but because we have Christ in us. I agree with that wholeheartedly. The difficulty is there's kind of this evolution that's happened out of Adam's work that's developed into this thing that's now kind of worldwide called biblical counseling, which is very different than Christian counseling in the sense that the term biblical counseling refers now to a model. Christian counseling, the word Christian is a philosophical word that says we're oriented toward the teachings of Christ, but biblical counseling these days labels and names a very specific model. And I'm just going to name a couple of my concerns and tell you why I'm concerned about those things. And I think, I don't know if you talk about this much at all, but so one of the things that you'll see is that one of their key tenets, and this is not coming from my opinion, this actually comes from the websites of the various organizations, the associations of biblical counseling, so the International Association of Biblical Counseling, the Association of Biblical Counselors. If you look at their tenets, they're going to tell you things like this. My greatest concern is this. We think, quoting them, we think that part of our job as a counselor, in fact, the main thrust of our job, is to discern the sin of our client and make sure that we confront the sin of our client with biblical truth so that they can correct their sin. So even if they've been in a painful situation, they can't do anything about the other person. We need to focus on their sin. So,
and the idea being you focus on your sin, and somehow then God has been arm twisted then into fixing your marriage or to fixing the other person. Is that the idea? Or whether that person changes or not, you're stuck and there's nothing you can do about it.
At the root of their idea, there's something important they're trying to get at, and that is that we all only have responsibility for ourselves. In the healing process, I can only be responsible for me.
Which sounds good.
My abuse is right. And that's true. I can only be responsible for me. If I'm going to set a boundary, I can't make the other person do something. I can set a boundary and tell them what I'm going to do. That part I'm 100% in agreement with. But when we make that about dealing with the person's sin, I have a concern to think that an abuse victim is present in counseling and that the focus of their counseling needs to be identifying the sin they committed and helping them repent of that sin and believing that that's God's desire and the most helpful thing you can give them.
What do you think is a better approach?
So I've developed about what I think is the ideal approach. Is this thing, someday my book will come out called Freedom Therapy. And here's what I think is I think God himself wants to interact with his people. And I think when it comes to abuse, I think it's important that if churches really want to help with this, they need to become somewhat trauma informed and certainly abuse aware in such a way that they can really see the bigger picture of the dynamics so that they're not trying to identify the sin of a person, but rather trying to help a person connect to God and become the healthiest and fullest version of who they were created to be. I'm afraid that using the term sin, much less the idea of sin, identify or somehow connotes that the person in front of you needs to be corrected for being wrong as opposed to healed for being wounded.
I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah. When somebody's shot in the chest, you don't ask them, why were you there? You identify where they're bleeding and you help them, help the bleeding stop. And then you set about to prevent infection. You don't say, why were you in front of the bullet?
Right. So what other concerns do you have about biblical counseling?
Here's the other one. So the biggest one for me is that they state in their own, in their own principles, this idea about zeroing in on the sin of the client in front of them. But the other thing is, and again, they state this clearly in their statements of practice, that they function within the context of the leadership of a church, which is a clever way to say, we don't respect the confidentiality of our clients. I looked up a couple of these before getting online with you. And one of them says, we submit to the elders and leaders of our church. And so if our clients need church discipline or discipleship, we will tell them what we've been talking about in counseling.
So there's no confidentiality.
Zero.
What you say to your biblical counselor could suddenly in one elder meeting be shared to 12 other people.
And potentially help it the next week.
And yeah, that's true. Yeah. And legally, actually, I understand that if you're a member of a church, absolutely nothing you say to anybody is confidential. And that's a scary thought.
So, primary to, I've been doing this 30 years, been licensed for 30 years. Primary to the work I do is the safety of the therapeutic relationship. The idea that if you sit down with me, what we talk about is protected and you are protected. And the biblical counseling associations are very overt that they will not protect you in that way. They view that, I think they view that as protection, but I just don't have enough faith in the health of all the elder board or any individual pastor to handle that stuff well.
Wow. You can you can see where this would be a setup. And I know there was a group of churches on the East Coast where the leader, the lead pastor, is alleged to have basically blackmailed people who thought they were going into a private counseling center, revealed something. And the leader in this case allegedly blackmailed them for very expensive vacations and overseas trips to cover up what they had revealed in a supposedly confidential counseling setting. That would not be as possible in a licensed therapy setting where the therapist is following the ethical requirements set forth by their state's licensing board.
Part of the idea is that, humans are imperfect, whether in the professional realm or in the ministry realm. In the professional realm, there are protections set in place by governing boards and by the various ways those governing boards can intervene with a therapist who's been harmful to his clients or his or her clients. Those boards and that kind of oversight doesn't exist in the church world. In many cases, it's the boards and the oversight that are the unhealthy or dysfunctional ones that simply multiply the dysfunction instead of provide safety and protection for the people. Again, it's not in every case, but we want to assume that we provide structures and processes that protect people from unhealthy people. And you get a legitimate governing body with the professional world. You get with every particular church organization, you get whatever it is they offer.
So what other concerns do you have with biblical counseling?
I think those are the two that I think are most notable. But to me, that's enough to say, I think it's just important that people understand that when they see the term biblical counseling associated with a name or a ministry, they understand what they're actually getting into when they sign up for that.
It is really eye-opening. Oh, I'd like to add one thing.
Okay.
If a couple comes to me, or if one person in the couple is what usually happens, comes to me and said, do you have a good counselor? Should I go see the counselor at XYZ church? And if I happen to know that this church has zero nuance on the topic of divorce, they don't allow divorce for any reason. It doesn't matter how badly you're being beaten or your children are being molested or, fill in the blank, how many affairs your spouse has had, their answer will always be to blame the victim and to tell you must stay. I generally will say, no, this counselor at this church has an agenda. And they don't really care about your safety. They are not safe for you. And they don't care if you live or die, and they don't care how much damage is done to you. Go find someone who at least has a nuanced view of divorce, who who says, sometimes divorce is the lesser of two evils. It is better than seeing the children and the spouse destroyed or driven to despair and depression and suicidal ideation, or exposed to more physical violence or even homicide. I mean, we've just seen a homicide in the last couple of weeks where a Christian wife was killed by her, apparently Christian, at least everyone else thought he was a Christian, husband. It was a murder-suicide thing. And so I have real concerns about church counselors who are either wedded to the idea that all divorce is evil, wrong, or displeasing to God. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm concerned about those kinds of cases too. So how would you advise churches and members alike to deal with abuse and addiction?
Top of the
list. We believe God has power. So what do we tell them?
Yeah, top of the list, I think there's an important and powerful marriage between well-trained mental health professionals and people of faith. I don't think it should be an either or. I think it should be a both and. I've tried to make that something that's true within my own thought process and within my own soul. But part of that is because I've got that training and background, and I've got, number of decades in my life of living a life of faith. But if churches are going to be in a helping type role, they need to have some kind of partnership with qualified mental health professionals, not just for their capacity to help, but sometimes even for liability reasons. It's just important to have someone who can see the things that they're trained to see when the people on your ministry teams may not be trained to see that. Secondly, I would say, really learn to recognize manipulation. Don't just eagerly trust people because you so badly want them to be trustworthy. Recognize that when we're dealing with broken people, sometimes their brokenness drives them to intentionally use your kindness against you and for their benefit. I also think that it's important to learn from the psychological world and from the family therapy world. You asked about my other concerns about the biblical counseling model. It didn't occur to me till I said this. One of the things I'm concerned about with that is that they automatically demonize the psychological world as if it's completely wrong and not of any valid perception. As soon as we can understand that everything that exists is something that God created, and anyone who's discovered truth, whether they credit it to him or not, is discovering God's truth, then we can really gain from the headway that we're making in the area of neuroscience and understanding things like the education that we've had on trauma in the last 30 years has taken us thousands of miles down the road in helping people who have been victims of abuse or victims of battlefield trauma, those kind of things. So if the church would be just open its mind to learn from the psychological / mental health world, it would take them miles down the road in their ability to help people. So I just think we could find a really powerful marriage between the faith that we have in Christ and our own ability to learn what we can learn about the human soul, both for our own well-being and for the well-being of the people that we're here to help.
Yeah. And this goes back to my college education. I went to Wheaton College. I have my degree in Bible and Christian education. And one of the things one of my professors always said was, all truth is God's truth.
Yeah.
If psychological research has done really good studies, I'm not talking about, little studies or,
right.
Studies that are skewed somehow, but I mean big nationwide studies or big, large, anything over 800 people who, followed through with the entire study. We need as Christians to accept that all truth is God's truth. There are some things that those psychological studies, these big research surveys. One of the things that really I find to be disturbing and distressing is when a pastoral counselor will discover that, let's say in premarital counseling, will discover that maybe the groom to be is attracted to children. And instead of relying on over 100 years of psychological testing and training, will just say, well, marriage will fix him, or this will all go away, or your good example, your healthy Christian family that you came from will bathe him in good examples, and he will be able to leave this behind. Well, it doesn't work that way. And psychological testing, basically, there's nothing in the academic literature that says things like pedophilia ever go away.
Yeah.
And so when our churches just fly headlong, it's almost, let's just be honest with it, it's like doctors in malpractice. Yeah. This is something that any conscientious person should have studied and would know. And our churches just throw out what we've known for years and say, no, trust God. And I just think that is so dangerous. And I'm not saying that all therapists, are good at this too, but goodness sakes,
there's a governing board. Yeah, there's
exactly
a governing board for that kind of thing. So yeah. So very much people need to value what we can get from the mental health world and the just incredible strides that we've made in research and understanding everything from what you just described to to what we now know about trauma and the ways of treating trauma, what we understand about the central nervous system, what we understand about the polyvagal nerve. I mean, there's just so many things that simply aren't in scripture, but are crucial to the healing of the soul. So the marriage of those two things is what I would recommend. So.
I want to tell people about two videos you and I have done recently, one on the dynamics of abuse, and your other is the fantastic 18-minute video called How Do I Know If My Spouse Has Really Changed? And I think both of those would be absolutely valuable to people who love the Lord and yet need some real wisdom and discernment in their life on these topics.
Yeah. And thanks for letting me do those with you. Those are two, if I could say two things to people in those situations, it would be those and then this. So love this.
All right. Well, thank you, Bob. This has really been eye-opening. I really appreciate it. I hope people walk away saying that you can love God and trust the Holy Spirit inside of you that says something is not right. Everyone around me, these bystanders, these onlookers, I'm not sure they're taking me in the right direction, and to follow the Lord in the path you feel like you need to go.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Bob. I so much appreciate this.
Thanks, Gretchen. Good to see you.
If you benefited from this recording, you will find support and clarity in my book, The Life-Saving Divorce, available in paperback or Kindle on Amazon and in 2022 as an audiobook. You can also follow me, Gretchen Baskerville, on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. You can sign up for my email list at lifesavingdivorce.com. Women and men of faith may request to join my private Facebook group, Life-Saving Divorce. For more on life-saving divorces, please subscribe and click the link to the next recording.